The rain in November of 1883 did not care that a man was being buried. It fell with the same cold indifference on the fresh pine of the coffin as it did on the muddy boots of the men who lowered it into the ground. Martha Brant stood apart from the small gathering, a thin black shawl doing little to stop the chill that had settled deep in her bones. Her knuckles were white where she gripped a single, worn book, its leather cover softened by years of use. The cold was not a feeling. It was a presence. It soaked the world and asked for nothing in return. Mr. Abernathy, who owned the general store and half the town council, broke away from the others. He did not approach with sympathy. He approached with the quiet confidence of a man holding all the good cards. "The town has a claim on your husband's debts, Martha," he said, his voice low but not unkind. It was simply a statement of fact. "You have until the first snow to clear them, or the bank takes the property." She did not look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the simple wooden barn that stood on the rise behind her small cabin. Inside that barn, sitting on a workbench next to a collection of seed jars, was a German-made hygrometer. A delicate instrument of brass and glass for measuring the moisture in the air. It was the strangest object in Providence Creek. And it was about to become the most important. We will explain what that was for in a moment. Let us know where you're watching from tonight, and what the weather is like in your part of the world. Martha was not from Providence Creek. Her husband, Jacob, had been. He was a quiet man, a German immigrant who carried his past in a trunk of books rather than a string of stories. He had seen the way she looked at the world, not as a place of settled facts, but as a series of questions waiting for answers. While other women in the valley gathered to quilt and trade gossip, Martha would be in the field with one of Jacob's books, reading about soil acidity or the patterns of migratory birds. She did not just read. She measured. She kept a logbook, its pages filled with neat columns of numbers and observations. Rainfall, captured in a tin can and measured with a notched stick. The date of the first frost, and the last. The day the crickets fell silent. The direction of the wind on summer evenings. Jacob had encouraged it. He had brought her the hygrometer from a trip to Denver, a gift of profound understanding. He knew her curiosity was not a flight of fancy. It was a tool for living. The town, however, saw it differently. They had no category for a woman who preferred the company of an almanac to the society of the church sewing circle. Her questions were unsettling. When she asked Mr. Abernathy why the seed potatoes he sold rotted in the ground some years and not others, he just shrugged. "It's the will of God, Martha." To her, it was a question of blight, of moisture, of crop rotation. To them, it was a question that ought not be asked. Her knowledge was an uncomfortable commodity in a world that ran on tradition and assumption. It was seen as useless, even arrogant. Mrs. Gable, the minister's wife and the town's arbiter of social grace, had once declared it within Martha's hearing. They were mending church linens, and Martha had mentioned a passage she'd read about preventing rust on iron tools. Mrs. Gable looked up from her needlework, her lips a thin line of disapproval. "It's an unnatural curiosity for a woman," she announced to the room. "She fills her head with numbers instead of scripture," the other women murmured in agreement. Her mind was a deviation, a flaw in the design of a proper wife. Jacob had been the buffer. His quiet strength and steady work ethic had earned him a grudging respect from the town. As long as he was there, her eccentricities were tolerated as the harmless habits of a foreigner's wife. But then came the early freeze in October. Jacob was caught in the north pasture, trying to bring in the last of the cattle. He came home soaked and shivering. The pneumonia took him in less than a week. With his death, the buffer was gone. She was no longer Jacob Brandt's wife. She was just the strange widow on the edge of town, the one with the books and the numbers. Abernathy's threat at the funeral was not a personal attack. It was the system correcting itself. A woman alone, in debt, with peculiar habits, was an untidy loose end. The town of Providence Creek preferred things to be tidy. Everyone expected a mild winter. The old-timers predicted it, based on the thickness of the corn husks and the behavior of the squirrels. But for 3 years, Martha's hygrometer had been telling a different story. Every autumn, the air was a little drier. Every winter, the cold settled a little deeper. The numbers in her logbook pointed not to a mild season, but to a severe one. The town was preparing for a winter of memory. Martha began preparing for the winter the numbers foretold. She had until the first snow. The first flakes began to fall 2 weeks later. The debt was a vulture. To satisfy it, she sold the cattle Jacob had died trying to save. She sold the wagon, the good plow, and most of the seed grain she had carefully stored. She was left with a small, mortgaged piece of land, a drafty cabin, 2 goats, and a handful of chickens. And the barn. The barn, and the field of hay behind it. The cold came not as a guest, but as an occupying army. It laid siege to her small cabin. The first week of December, the temperature dropped to 10 degrees and stayed there. The wind was a constant, probing pressure, finding every chink in the log walls, every crack around the window frames. Waking up was a slow, painful process. Her first breath was a cloud of white vapor in the dim light. The water in the bucket by the hearth was a solid block of ice. She had to chip it out and melt it just to make coffee. The fire was a demanding god. It consumed the wood she had split and stacked with a relentless appetite. She rationed it, letting the cabin grow cold during the day while she was working outside, and building the fire up only after sunset. She wore 3 layers of clothes indoors. Still, the cold seeped in. Her teeth began to ache, a dull, constant throb that came from shivering for hours on end. Her fingers, when she came in from feeding the goats, would burn for 10 minutes and then go numb, a terrifying absence of feeling. She would sit by the fire, flexing them, willing the blood to return, watching them turn from dead white to an angry, mottled red. She was always hungry. The flour and beans were a finite resource, measured out with grim precision. She made a thin stew with dried vegetables from her summer garden. The goats gave a little milk, and the chickens an occasional egg. It was enough to survive. It was not enough to feel warm. The hunger was a coldness inside her, a hollow companion to the cold outside. Some days, a wave of dizziness would wash over her as she stood up, and she would have to grip the back of a chair until the world stopped tilting. One night, the wind rose to a shriek. It rattled the single window in its frame and drove fine particles of snow through the gaps in the door. The cabin, which had felt like a shelter, now felt like a trap. She lay under every blanket she owned, the goats huddled in the corner for shared warmth, and listened to the storm. And she considered giving up. She thought about walking the 2 miles to town. She pictured knocking on the door of Abernathy's fine, 2-story house. She imagined the warmth that would spill out, the smell of roasting meat, the murmur of voices. She could surrender the land. He would take it. The debt would be gone. Perhaps they would let her work in the kitchen at the boarding house. She would be warm. She would eat regular meals. She would not be alone with the sound of the wind. This was a real possibility. A quiet end to her strange story. Lying in the dark, with the cold pressing in, it felt like a sensible choice. What pulled her back was not a prayer, or a memory of Jacob's face. It was a sentence. A simple, declarative sentence from a German book on physics she had read years ago. Die Isolierung ist ein Function do eingeschlossenen Luft. Insulation is a function of trapped air. The word surfaced in her mind, clear and precise. The enemy was not the cold. The enemy was moving air. The wind stole heat. If she could stop the air from moving, she could slow the theft. The problem shifted in her mind. It was no longer a matter of endurance. It was a matter of engineering. The body makes its own decisions sometimes, before the mind has fully consented. Her feet were on the cold floorboards before she had consciously decided to rise. She had a task. And the task was more compelling than the despair. The solution was waiting for her, half buried in the snow. Jacob had been insistent on planting 10 acres of timothy hay every year. It was more than they needed for their own livestock. The other farmers, who planted cash crops of wheat and corn right up to their fence lines, thought it was a waste of good soil. That's land insurance, Jacob would say with a shrug. You don't know you need it until you need it. Now, standing in the biting wind, looking out at the field, Martha saw it. Dozens of large, dense bales of hay, cut and bound in late summer, now frozen solid. They were useless as feed. She had only 2 goats. But they were not feed. They were blocks. They were bricks. She walked out to the barn. The wind cut across the open space, stealing her breath. Inside, the air was still, but brutally cold. Her precious firewood was stacked against the north wall. She ran a hand over the logs. They were dry, but she could feel the deep, penetrating chill in the wood. It took more energy to burn cold wood. Driving snow could get through the cracks between the barn boards, dusting the woodpile with moisture, making it smolder and hiss. She looked at the wood. Then she walked back to the edge of the field and placed her hand on a frozen bale of hay. It was solid. Heavy. It was a wall. She did not feel a surge of hope. She did not feel relief. She felt the quiet, profound satisfaction of recognition. It was the moment a mathematician sees the elegant, undeniable proof of a difficult theorem. It was not a miracle. It was the correct answer. The land had provided the material. A book had provided the principle. The work was up to her. This was right. This would work. The work was brutal. Each bale of hay weighed more than she did, a dense, frozen block of stored summer sunlight. She had no pulley, no winch, no help. She had a long iron pry bar and a simple wooden lever Jacob had made for moving rocks. That, and the unyielding logic of physics. She began with the north wall of the barn, the side that faced the prevailing winter wind. Getting the first bale from the field to the barn was a lesson in humility and geometry. She wrestled it onto a small wooden sled, her breath coming in ragged plumes. She pulled, her boots slipping on the icy ground, every muscle straining. It took an hour to move one bale 50 yards. At the barn, she used the lever. She would drive the iron bar into the frozen ground for leverage, place the wooden beam, and slowly, painstakingly, heave the bale upright and tight against the wooden wall. The first one was the hardest. The second was just as hard. By the end of the first day, she had moved for bales. Her back screamed in protest. Her hands were raw, the skin split and bleeding even through her thick gloves. She went back to her cabin, ate a miserly dinner of watery stew, and fell into an exhausted sleep, only to wake before dawn and do it again. The town noticed. People on their way to the trading post would slow their wagons as they passed her property. They saw the lone woman, day after day, wrestling with the huge bales. They saw the strange, lopsided wall of hay beginning to grow against her barn. It looked absurd. It looked desperate. Children pointed. Men laughed amongst themselves. "Look at the widow building her hay house," a boy shouted from a passing sleigh. His father pulled him back, but he was smiling. They saw a woman unhinged by grief, performing a bizarre and useless ritual. Martha heard them. She saw their smirks, their shaking heads. She did not care. They were outside the equation. They did not understand the problem she was solving. She worked with a grim, methodical rhythm. Lever, heave, slide. Lever, heave, slide. She stacked them 3 high, a solid wall of insulation 9 feet tall. Then she started a second layer, overlapping the first, covering the seams. It took her 3 weeks. 3 weeks of burning muscles, splintered hands, and the quiet mockery of her neighbors. When she was done, the barn was encased on 3 sides by a thick, seamless shell of hay. For the roof, she dragged old pieces of canvas, stiff with frost, over the top and weighted them down with logs, creating a sealed, insulated envelope. The first great blizzard of the year arrived 2 days after she finished. It did not come gently. It descended on Providence Creek like a judgment. The wind howled for 3 days and 3 nights, a physical presence that seemed intent on scouring the world clean. The snow fell so thick and fast it erased the landscape, burying fences, drifting up against doors, reducing the world to a churning vortex of white. When it finally stopped, the silence was absolute. The valley was buried under 4 feet of snow, with drifts as high as a man's head. It took the men of the town a full day to dig themselves out, to clear paths to their own woodsheds and barns. What they found was discouraging. The fine, driving snow had been forced through every crack and crevice. Their woodpiles, stored in simple, unsealed sheds, were covered in a thick layer of white. The logs were soaked through with melting snow. That morning, Martha dug a narrow path from her cabin to the great, hay bale monolith that had once been her barn. The snow was drifted high against it, but the structure was sound. She pulled open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The air was still. It was cold, but it was a dry, calm cold, not the biting, damp chill of the outside world. There were no drafts. No fine dustings of snow. She walked over to the workbench and looked at the hygrometer. The needle pointed to a level of humidity that was astonishingly low. She went to the woodpile, reached to the very top, and pulled down a split log of oak. She ran her bare, chapped hand over its surface. It was perfect. It was utterly, completely dry. She returned to her cabin, loaded the stove, and opened the flue. The wood caught immediately, and within minutes, a hot, clean fire was roaring in the hearth. Outside, a steady, confident plume of white smoke rose from her chimney into the crisp, blue air. It was the only smoke in the valley that morning. Everywhere else, chimneys produced a weak, sputtering hiss of grey, steamy smoke as people tried in vain to burn their wet, useless wood. Her chimney smoke was the first proof. It was an announcement, written against the sky, that her strange, foolish work had been anything but. An old man named Joseph was the first to understand. He was a Ute who lived alone in a small cabin up the creek, a man the town tolerated but never truly included. He survived by observing things the townsfolk had forgotten how to see. He saw the plume of smoke from Martha's cabin, and he knew what it meant. He arrived later that day, walking on snowshoes, not to ask for anything, but to witness. He walked a slow circle around the hay-walled barn, his weathered face impassive. He touched the frozen bales, ran a hand along the canvas roof. He understood insulation. He understood trapped air. He looked at Martha, who watched him from her doorway, and gave a single, slow nod. He pointed to the flat canvas roof, now burdened with a heavy load of snow. "Snow heavy," he said, "he's English spare." He went into the woods and returned with 2 long, straight saplings. Using his knife, he showed her how to lash them together into a simple A-frame to place on top, a ridgepole that would help the roof shed the weight of the next snowfall. He did not praise her. He did not offer condolences for her husband. He simply saw her competence and added his own. He left a string of dried trout on her doorstep. He was the first person to see her work not as madness, but as mastery. The cold did not relent. It deepened. The town began to suffer. A week after the blizzard, the temperature plunged to 20 below zero and stayed there. The people's woodpiles, once thought sufficient for a mild winter, were dwindling at an alarming rate. What was left was damp and puny. It hissed and smoked, producing little heat and filling cabins with acrid fumes. A sickness, a deep cough that settled in the chest, began to move through the town. Dr. Hemmings was the first to come. His own wife was ill, and his woodshed was full of sputtering, wet pine. He arrived at Martha's cabin at dusk, his face etched with worry, his pride left somewhere back in town. He stood on her porch, hat in his hands. "Martha," he said, his voice rough. I hear your wood is dry. I'll pay double the price." She simply nodded. She led him not to her cabin, but to the barn. She opened the door, and the doctor stared. In the lantern light, the stacks of dry, seasoned oak and maple looked like a king's treasure. She helped him load his small sled. When he tried to pay her double, she refused. She charged him the standard price Abernathy had set at the general store in the fall. Word traveled as fast as gossip. The doctor's chimney was soon billowing thick, warm smoke. His wife began to recover. The next day, the blacksmith came. His son was sick. Then the Gable family, the the minister's wife looking at the ground, unable to meet Martha's eyes. They came one by one, then in pairs. They did not apologize for their mockery. They did not praise her ingenuity. They came for the firewood. Their need for warmth had become more powerful than their pride. They stood before the towering, snow-dusted walls of hay, the structure they had laughed at, and it no longer looked foolish. It looked like salvation. A month into the deep freeze, the town's reserves were gone. Abernathy's general store had long since run out of the few bags of coal he'd had in stock. His own woodpile was a sorry mound of ice-encrusted logs. His wife had taken ill, and his authority, once the most solid currency in Providence Creek, was useless against the unyielding cold. He came to her on foot. The snow was too deep and drifted for his fine buggy. He walked the 2 miles from town, following the packed trail made by the desperate feet of his neighbors. When he arrived at her cabin, he was not the confident man who had delivered an ultimatum at her husband's grave. He looked smaller. The crisp certainty of his wool suit was gone, hidden under a heavy, worn coat. The cold had pinched his face, stripping away the veneer of command, leaving only a tired, anxious man. The hardness in him had gone brittle. He stood at her door, breathing hard, his mustache frosted with ice. "Martha," he began, then stopped. The words would not come. He, who had always had the right words, the right numbers, the right price for everything, had no language for this transaction. He did not know how to ask for help from the woman he had threatened. Martha looked at him. Then she looked past him, at the narrow path he had trudged through the snow. Her response was not emotional. It was logistical. "How much do you need?" she asked. Her voice was level, calm. "Is it just for your house, or for the store too?" She did not wait for an answer. She turned and walked toward the barn. He followed her, a supplicant in the wake of a queen. The power dynamic had completely inverted, and her only acknowledgement of it was to treat the situation as a problem of distribution. The problem was simple: people were cold. The solution was in her barn. She helped him load a heavy canvas sling with dry oak. He worked beside her in silence, his movements stiff and awkward. He was not a man accustomed to physical labor. When the sling was full, he straightened up, his back aching. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound ledger. He fumbled with the frozen pages until he found the one he was looking for. He took out a pencil and drew a thick, decisive line through an entry. "Your husband's debt," he said, his eyes fixed on the page. "It's cleared. Paid in full." He did not say thank you. He did not say he was sorry. He did not admit he had been wrong. He simply cancelled the debt. It was a transactional apology, the only kind he knew how to give. It cost him money. It cost him the last piece of leverage he had over her. For Abernathy, it was the most profound admission of defeat he could make. It was enough. Martha looked at the ledger, then at the wood piled on the canvas. "The wood will burn better if you stack it with air between the logs," she said. "It needs to breathe." It was the only forgiveness she offered. Not absolution. Just another piece of practical advice. A continuation of the work. Martha Brandt lived for another 20 years. She never remarried. She never became a fixture at town socials or church gatherings. Her place was not inside those walls. But her farm, the place once seen as the home of an eccentric widow, became a different kind of center for the valley. They called it the hay bale farm. Young farmers, fresh from the east with heads full of book learning but no practical sense, were told to go see the widow Brandt. They came to her, not for gossip, but for knowledge. She taught them about soil composition, showing them how to read the health of the land in the color of the clay. She taught them about crop rotation, about seed saving, about reading the signs of a coming hard winter in the behavior of the bees and the height of the goldenrod. She taught anyone who came and asked sincerely. She gave her knowledge away as freely as she had given her firewood. She died in the spring, on a Tuesday in May, sitting in the rocking chair on her front porch. A book of German poetry lay open in her lap. The cup of chamomile tea on the small table beside her was still warm. Down at the barn, a young man she had trained for the past 3 years was showing a newcomer how to repair the south wall, where the winter sun had begun to rot the oldest bales. The work was continuing. Over the next half-century, the practice of hay bale insulation became common in that part of the country. Farmers called it Brandt's Wall. It saved the town of Providence Creek through 2 more winters that the newspapers called unprecedented, winters that would have otherwise broken them. She had fed hundreds with the produce from her intelligently managed land and, by the town's own count, kept at least a dozen families from freezing to death during that first, terrible winter. Her headstone, paid for by a town council resolution, was carved from local granite. It had one short sentence. Martha Brandt. She kept the fire burning. Perhaps you have a wall of your own you've been building. Something the world told you was cheap, or useless, or a waste of your time. A skill, a knowledge, a quiet observation that doesn't fit into the categories people have for you. You stand outside the door to your own barn, wondering if the work is worth the ridicule. What is the firewood you are trying to keep dry? The German hygrometer on her shelf measured the unseen truth in the air, just as she did. The world often mistakes preparation for foolishness until the storm arrives. If stories of quiet resilience speak to you, subscribe for more like this. We'll be exploring the story of the lone mapmaker of the Sierra Nevadas next.